Hi everyone, my name is Saff Killingsworth and I'm an endangered species conservation biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And I'm going to talk to you all today about the State of the Bees initiative, which is our effort to assess the conservation status of all US bee species. The Xerces Society is a science-based nonprofit organization that works to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And we do that in a couple of different programs. One of them is the Endangered Species Conservation Program, which is the program I work in. And we also work on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, reducing pesticide use, community engagement, and policy. And this image here is the Xerces blue butterfly, after which we are named, which was the first butterfly, the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human causes. We are a member-supported nonprofit, so the work that we do is dependent on donations from our members. So if you're a member here today, thank you so much for your contribution towards this work. And if you're not a member and you're interested in becoming one, you can learn more by using the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen or visit xerces.org/join. Okay, unfortunately, I have to start with the bad news that we know that pollinators are in decline based on studies from all over the world, from all different groups of pollinators, including bees and butterflies and beetles. And we also know that pollinator decline is likely to have a number of serious implications for the stability of our agricultural systems and also in our wildlands. And it's based on this information that pollinator conservation has really grown in the last several decades, both with interest and funding. And that's been really great. It's delivered a lot of really important conservation to species that desperately need it. And while we do have good evidence that certain groups of pollinators are imperiled, we don't yet have information about many species, including most of the over 3,600 species of bees that occur in the US. So while some generalized pollinator conservation practices may deliver results across a broad swath of bees, we really need more information about which bees are stable and which bees are at risk in order to design a more targeted approach that can help recover species that are most imperiled. We want to be able to do pollinator conservation in a more meaningful way, given the limited funding and power that we have. And in order to do that, we need to understand the state of the bees in the US and beyond, and then tailor our conservation efforts to meet the specific needs of imperiled bees. Okay, so how do we decide which species are endangered? There's a number of different frameworks that we can use to determine which species are stable and which species are at risk. Those include extinction risk assessments, which I'm going to talk mostly about throughout this presentation, but I'm also going to touch on the legal frameworks and academic work. Extinction risk assessments are a standardized approach to assign a conservation rank to a species. And there's two broadly accepted methods to do this. One of them is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. That's the IUCN Red List for short. This is a globally accepted standard where the emphasis is generally on assessing the extinction risk of a species across its entire range. So I'm showing you here the IUCN Red List assessment for the rusty patch bumblebee, which if you can see on this this bar at the top and this red blob, that there's a number of available conservation ranks, and the one that's been assigned to this species is critically endangered. And what you can't see on this assessment is that it also includes a review of the species biology, as well as its threats, and then conservation recommendations for the species. The second assessment, the extinction risk assessment approach, is from NatureServe. This is a ranking system that's used in the US and Canada. And one of its strengths is that it can be easily communicated at the state and province level through partnerships with state heritage programs and state wildlife biologists. And so what I'm showing you here is a NatureServe assessment for a peregrine falcon. We're going to briefly step out of the invertebrate world for a moment to look at this bird. And what you can see from the top bar here, this blue circle that says apparently secure, is that the species is assessed across the North America as apparently secure, but you can also see that it has different rankings in different parts of its range. So this really allows us to sort of dial down on what parts of the range is the species facing a little bit more risk, even though overall it's ranked as apparently secure. Both of these sets of methods were developed by multiple experts and were peer reviewed and they're meant to work well across all different kinds of organisms. They are applied on anything from corals to whales, and they can also be used to assess plants as well. I'm showing you a side-by-side of the nature rank system and the IUCN red list categories, where a species can be ranked anywhere from unrankable or data deficient to presumed extinct, with some intermediate ranks of secure and vulnerable and critically imperiled. Both of these methods are accompanied by a long, comprehensive sort of documentation of how they work. Very briefly, the ranks are based on a number of criteria, including species that have small population sizes, species that have seen population size reduction, species that have restricted ranges where threats are occurring there. And they can also take into consideration poor habitat quality, including things like habitat fragmentation or a decline in the habitat area or the quality. The second approach to understanding if something is at risk of extinction or is endangered is through the use of legal frameworks, such as the Endangered Species Act. While the extinction risk assessments that I've just talked about are a non-regulatory way of assigning a conservation rank to a species, a listing under the Endangered Species Act is a regulatory framework that allows for a species to be protected by law. This process begins with writing a petition to list a species, which the petition in this sense of the word is a comprehensive review of the species status and threats. These are most often written, they can be written by anybody, but they're most often written by biologists with knowledge of the species. And they can often rely on extinction risk assessments. And Xerces has petitioned a number of species to be listed as endangered with a pretty good success rate. So I'm showing you 4 petitions that we've worked on. The top 2 are species that have gone through the entire process and are now legally protected. So the top one is a species of Hawaiian yellow-faced bee, and then we have the rusty patch bumblebee. And on the bottom are 2 species that are still in process, and they are the large marble and the Southwest Springs firefly. And then the last avenue that we will talk about here today is through academic research. And this academic research can really help us to understand extinction risk. It really adds to this body of research about a species. It neither provides a standardized rank or provides legal protection, but our partnerships with researchers and the research that we do really helps add another layer of complexity to our understanding of what's going on with a given species. And that research can often be used in either the standardized ranking system or within the legal framework. So I'm showing you here the state of the butterflies work that Xerces has been involved in for a number of years. And this is a paper that just came out this year with a number of Xerces colleagues where the researchers, you can see that there's a really long list of authors on this paper. So it was an incredible collaborative effort where researchers looked at decline in butterfly abundance across over 500 US bee species, and that really helped us understand what's some of the population dynamics of a number of the species that we have already identified as at risk. Okay, so why are the extinction risk assessments such an important part of the process? For many species that are assessed for the first time, it's often the first time that anyone's looked at their conservation status. So it's really the first time that a lot of species get highlighted as being in need of some conservation action. Species with an extinction risk assessment can also be more easily included in conservation efforts at the state level. And one of the ways that happens is through state wildlife action plans. I'm showing you the newly revised state wildlife action plan for New Mexico here. And this is a document that each state's Fish and Wildlife Agency develops and maintains and then revises every 10 years that highlights the conservation priorities for the state for that 10-year period. And within these plans, there is a list of species of greatest conservation need. Those are the species that the state has identified as priorities for directing conservation attention towards. And species that have an extinction risk rank can more easily be included into these lists, and thus attention and funding is devoted to their conservation. Assessments can also be included in regulatory frameworks like an endangered species listing, like I've mentioned before. And then also the extinction risk assessment process can really help to elevate the public profile of many species. And that can lead to identifying research needs for the species and also inspire voluntary conservation actions that are taken before the species might go through a process of legal protection. One example of sort of how this pipeline has worked is the Southwest Springs firefly. This is a species that was assessed as vulnerable using the IUCN and NatureServe frameworks in 2021 by our Xerces colleague, Candace Fallon, as well as our external partner, Anna Walker. And this assessment helped to identify some critical knowledge gaps for the species, and then also helped to build relationships with land managers where the species occurs and elevated its public profile. So there became more members of the public that were interested in this species and its conservation. In 2023, this species was petitioned to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And then in 2024, it received a positive 90-day finding, which is basically, that means that the US Fish and Wildlife Service has decided that their conservation, that a listing for this species may be warranted. It's not the end of the road for this species. What happens now is that the US Fish and Wildlife Service undertakes a species status assessment, which is their sort of collating of all available information and analysis. And that informs a 12-month finding where they release sort of one of their answers. The result can be three things: either that a listing is warranted, and then they propose a listing. They can also decide that a listing is not warranted. And lastly, they can decide that a listing is warranted, but may be precluded by higher priorities. Okay, so using the extinction risk assessment framework, what do we know about US bees so far? A recent study from Cornelisi et al. 2025 on North American pollinator extinction risk evaluated the extinction risk for nearly 500 bees, and they found that about 35% of those face some risk of extinction. So that's this top bar here. We also know from work from our Xerces colleagues, Rich Hatfield and Serena Jepson, as well as others, that about 25% of North American bumblebees are at risk. And globally, that's anywhere from 13 to 45%, depending on the region. And you'll notice if you look at this map, there's a number of gray circles where certain regions of the US or certain regions of the world have not yet had their bumblebee fauna assessed yet. Overall, in the US, only about 600 of our 3,600 species of bees have been assessed. And that's made up of just a few comprehensively assessed groups, including the bumblebees, the leafcutter bees, the mason bees, the wool carder bees. And these bees are not necessarily representative of bees generally. So there's over 3,000 species that have not yet had their conservation statuses assessed, which means we really don't know how they're doing in terms of if they're stable, if they're in decline, if they're endangered, so anywhere along that spectrum. We know that all species have unique needs and threats. And while it's true that some actions to benefit pollinators generally may help conserve a broad range of species, we really need to be able to understand the risks to all species. So I'm showing you on this image the map of the western bumblebee, which is this light green. This is a species that's being considered for listing under the Endangered Species Act, and Xerces has been working to advance the conservation of this species for over a decade. It was historically common across most of the western United States. And then I'm also showing you the range of Andrena blenospermatis, which is this little green dot. Andrina blenospermatis is a solitary bee that's a habitat specialist. It only occurs in the rare and threatened vernal pool systems of the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's also an extreme dietary specialist. So it only forages from a couple of closely related plant species. And it also occurs entirely within the range of the Western bumblebee. So while it's possible that a reduction in insecticides, for example, across the range of the Western bumblebee might lead to some benefits for Andrina blenospermatis, this Andrina bee really needs conservation attention tailored to its unique biology. So namely, that's conserving the rare vernal pools where it occurs. It's ensuring that it has stable and abundant populations of its host plants. And it's also limiting mosquito abatement practices where it lives. If we're only to focus our conservation attention on bees that we know about, some of our more specialized bees like this they're likely to slip through the cracks. Even though we don't know as much as we want to about which species are imperiled and which are not, we do know a lot about threats. We know that many of the threats acting on some of our better studied species are also likely to be acting on the species that we know less about. So these include things like habitat loss and degradation, climate change, exposure to pesticides, spread of pathogens and diseases from the non-native European honeybee, and also managed populations of bumblebees that are used in agriculture, and also competition with honeybees. And we also know that a decline or a loss in our bee fauna will have a huge cascading effect in the stability of our ecosystems and agricultural systems. We've seen trends in the US and also abroad of somewhere between 25 and 35% imperilment rates. And so if that's true for all US bee fauna, that could mean anywhere from 900 to over 1,200 imperiled species. And we need information about which species those are and what they need now. Okay, so how are we working on this? The Xerces Society is leading the State of the Bees initiative with our colleagues at the Woodard Lab at UC Riverside, including Dr. Hollis Woodard and Dr. Oscar Martinez Lopez. And we are also collaborating with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, as well as the state wildlife agencies of California, Washington, Vermont, and Texas. We are funded through 2026 through the Office of Conservation Investment, as well as some private foundation funding. And post 2026, our funding is uncertain, but we will be pursuing additional funding to be able to carry this project forward. Our broad goals are to assess the extinction risk of all US bee species, which is what I'm going to talk about for the majority of the rest of this presentation. And then we also want to make species trait, habitat, threats, and rank information available to land managers, policymakers, conservation biologists, and members of the public. And then we also want to be able to identify species or regions that are most at risk and design conservation plans to protect them. So how do we accomplish this first goal? In theory, it's as simple as applying the standardized methods for assessing extinction risk to the data that are available. And unfortunately, it's not quite as straightforward as that sounds. There are a number of challenges that I'm going to walk you through. But in order to understand that, I'm going to give you a lightning fast primer on wild bee biology. If you've been to a Xerces presentation on bees, you may have seen a slide like this. So congratulations for already being an expert on this. And if you're new here, welcome. Solitary bees are different than the non-native European honeybee and our bumblebees, which are social species that have they live in colonies and have a caste system with a queen and workers. Solitary bees differ from that in that they live the majority of their life alone. They emerge anywhere from early spring to late fall, and that when they emerge depends on their specific biology and their host plants and a number of other factors. In this case, the adult bee emerges in the spring. Males and females mate. The males quickly die, RIP, and then the females go on to live for just a couple more weeks to provision nests for their offspring. So for about 70% of species, these are nests that occur in the ground. And for the remainder, the 30, they nest in stems and twigs and other woody material. So I'm showing you a ground nesting species here. The female bee will collect pollen and nectar, provision a nest cell or multiple nest cells in the case of most bees, lay an egg. That egg hatches to become a larva. That larva consumes the pollen and nectar, and then it pupates and then overwinters as a pupa. Another way to look at this is through this sort of above ground, below ground schematic. So in this case, the adult bee emerges in February and March. The species mate in about April. The males die. The females go on to provision a nest. The larva is eating its pollen through the summer and then pupates before winter and then overwinters as a pupa. So you can see that there's just a really narrow time that these species are above ground and detectable for bee researchers like us. Okay, so now that you're an expert on bee biology, we go back to our primary task of applying the standardized extinction risk methods to our data. What is our data? Where do our data come from? Available bee data come from about 2.9 million digitized museum specimen records. And these are specimens that are generated from a number of not necessarily coordinated bee research projects across the US and beyond. So somebody that's studying apple pollination in Vermont with somebody that's doing a bee inventory of the Saguaro National Park, with somebody that is studying how a bee fauna changes over time in the Great Lakes region. All of these data, all of these specimens are curated in museums at universities and other research institutions. And then the associated data is digitized and becomes available to an end user like me. There are an additional estimated 5 million specimens that exist somewhere in museums, but their data is not yet digitized, so not yet available for analysis. And there's a number of ways that the data that are available are limited in their quality and quantity with regards to asking big questions like I'm asking, like how is a bee doing across its entire range? And so I'll walk you through some of those issues now. One of the ways that that contributes to the limited bee data is from biological challenges. So there's a number of aspects of bee biology that contribute to the data that we have available. And one of them is that bees are small and hard to detect. So I'm showing you here an image of one of our smallest bees, Perdita minima, which is smaller than a grain of rice. And so there's a number of challenges with just detecting bees because they're so hard to pick up on. Many species are not readily identified by non-experts. So contrast that to butterflies, where you can generally take a photo of a butterfly and have it ID'd or ID it yourself. That's not really possible with most bee species. Many species have these narrow phenological windows. So if you think back to that above ground, below ground schematic that I showed you, they're just above ground for a period of a couple weeks. And if you're a little late or you're a little early, or the season progresses earlier than you thought, you might miss the species that you're after. And then a number of species are habitat specialists with narrow ranges that we don't totally understand the bounds of. So if you're after a certain bee, but you're in the wrong spot, you're not going to detect the species that you're looking for. There's also a number of structural challenges. The first of these is the underfunding of taxonomists and the institutions that support them. So this means that there may be many existing specimens that are not yet identified or digitized due to lack of appropriate funding. Taxonomists are the scientists that help us understand what species even are, where the bounds of a species is, and help provide some of the information for keys for identifying them or guides to identifying them. And so without appropriate funding for taxonomists, we lack some of the updated taxonomic resources that help us understand and identify bees at the species level. There's also lack of systematic range-wide surveys. So I mentioned that many of the data come from these not necessarily coordinated efforts, and we do our best to make that meaningful across the range of a species, but we really need surveys that occur across the US that are systematic. And then lastly, records rarely include important contextual information like sampling method and sampling effort. And these two little bits of data are really important for helping us understand the rarity or the commonness of a given species. So when I look at a single data point, I want to know the conditions that produced that single data point. Is it because one researcher got out of his or her car, and swung a net and immediately caught the species? Or is it because 10 researchers looked for 10 days for the species and only encountered it one time? That kind of information really helps me to understand how rare something might truly be. There's been a number of recent bee data papers that I'm going to share with you. A study from Cheshire et al. 2023 showed that when we use all cleaned digitized occurrence records for US bee species, only about 6 to 37% of the US can be considered completely sampled, depending on the spatial scale we're looking at. So on this map, the yellow areas are regions where the observed species richness is not close to the expected species richness. We expect many more species than have been detected there. And then these blue-green areas that are scant across this map are the areas where our observed species richness is approaching our expected species richness. This problem persists even when the additional 5 million data points that are not yet digitized are projected onto this model. So that means that we need both support for digitizing existing specimens and then to continue sampling for bees. The data set that results from this publication provides a comprehensive data set for about 3,000 bee species, but in it, there's over 1,000 species that are known from 20 observations or fewer. So that means that estimating something like a population trend is really difficult for those species. Another research paper published in 2024 by Rousseau et al. Shows that only about half of US bee species have been observed in the last decade. So the colors on this map represent the number of species observed in the last 10 years by state, while the number overlaid represents the percentage of each state's known bee fauna that's been observed from the last decade. So when we look at Idaho, that number 9 there means that only 9% of that state's known bee fauna has been observed in the last 10 years. That same paper showed that information to contextualize occurrence records like sampling effort and protocol, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, that those data rarely accompany digitized museum specimen records. That's represented by this tiny red slice at the far right of this graph. So without that information, we can really only speculate about things like population trends and recent absences of certain species. We know that there's a lot that we could do to improve the quality of our data, and this will take a lot of time and money and energy and coordination. We don't have time to wait for the perfect data. Data is sort of like always coming in a slow trickle, and assessments are iterative. So the extinction risk assessment process can be revised. Those assessments can be revised as new data become available. We need to be able to understand the state of the bees now so we can act to conserve those that are most imperiled. Okay, so what does the state of the data mean with regards to assessments? Some of the criteria that are available are clearly, although they're designed to work for all taxa, all different kinds of plants and animals, they clearly work better for some organisms than others based on the amount of data that we have for them. So think of something like a polar bear, where we may actually have enough data to sort of estimate like how many polar bears are alive in the wild and how does that number change over time. We don't have that kind of data for bees. So some of the criteria that I'm showing you from this IUCN, on the right-hand side is a IUCN criteria for assessment, just a couple of them. Some of those criteria are based on population reductions, small population sizes, and habitat fragmentation, and we just don't have the kind of data that would allow us to answer questions about these kinds of subjects. We're still able to use criteria that deal with small ranges, but there's an issue with that. So we can not really assess a population trend. We can still look at species that have small range sizes with threats that are occurring there. But if we only use the existing methods that we have, we risk underestimating imperilment for our widespread species. So this really begets the need for enhanced methods. And this is something that I've been working on closely with Dr. Hollis Woodard and Dr. Oscar Martinez Lopez from UC Riverside. We want methods that work better for poorly understood taxa, and we want wider input from the bee research community. Although there's these standardized methods that have like a lot of the sort of decision points laid out, there's still quite a number of subjective decision-making points in the assessment process, and we want to reduce those as much as we possibly can. And then we want transparency, efficiency, and replicability along the way so that anyone following the same protocol with the same data would arrive at the same extinction rank. So together with our partners, we've worked on this set of enhanced methods. This has been a collaborative effort with broad buy-in from the bee research community to sort of lay out a step-by-step plan of how do you go from having data and the criteria to making all these decisions about which criteria to apply and how you decide when to apply them. So here is an example of our step-by-step workflow that we've worked on so far. Central to the enhanced methods, or two of the major problems we're trying to solve, is defining data deficiency. This is not very well defined in either the NatureServe or the IUCN methods. And with just a little bit of work, we could really help kind of make some thresholds for what counts as a data deficient species and what does not. And then also we are trying to solve this issue of like, what do we do with our widespread species? If we can't estimate a population trend for them, how do we determine if they're at risk or not? And one of the things that we're doing is using species distribution models to help better understand data poor or widespread species. And I'll talk a little bit more about what is a species distribution model. First, there's a number of ways that anyone could sort of draw a range for a given species, and they run the gamut from crude to more refined. And one of the ways that this is done in the existing frameworks, the existing methods frameworks, is through an extent of occurrence using a minimum convex polygon. And that's just a fancy way of saying like we draw a circle around we draw a polygon around all of the points that we have available for a species. So here is a bee species and all of its known records. And what you can see from this is that the polygon drawn from all known records of the species, it includes Nevada, although the species has never been recorded there. So it's really not a very refined understanding of like, does it occur in Nevada or not? We have questions here. A more refined option is the use of a species distribution model. And these are hypotheses about where a species might occur based on the characteristics of the areas where the species has been recorded. So the way that these are generated is that even if we have just a few data points, we look at the conditions that are occurring at where each of those data points are recorded. So we look at things like climate, you can look at elevation or slope. You can look in really refined models, you can use like plant species distribution, you can use plant communities. And then the model identifies all of the other regions where those conditions might also be met. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the output for this same species, Andrena obligata, that shows everywhere that it may occur or that these conditions are met from sort of low confidence to high confidence. And in the middle, this middle panel here is when we restrict that to just our high confidence. Like we're really certain that those conditions are met at everywhere that's this dark red color. And then we can restrict that further if we want to where it's been recorded using this minimum convex polygon. So once we're able to generate a sort of more refined idea of where the species lives, we can then do a number of quantitative analyses with regards to threats. So we can look at this range and say what % of its range would be lost or no longer inhabitable under climate change scenarios, or what % of this range has seen bee toxic loads of pesticides applied in the last 10 years, or what percent of this range has been converted from wildlands to urban areas in the last 10 years, and use that to understand the extinction risk of some of these widespread species that we don't really know as much about. Again, these are hypotheses, these ranges are hypotheses, so they need to be tested, but with the amount of information that we have available, this is really our best bet for understanding where a species occurs and what threats it might be facing. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing assessing species so far. I've been working on doing extinction risk assessments for the genus of bees Andrena. These are mining bees. There's about 450 species of this genus in the US, and they're all solitary and ground nesting species. And there's a high percentage of dietary specialists. So that means that many of the bees in this genus restrict their foraging to just a subset of available plant species, and that's not something they can change. It's like an evolutionarily constrained relationship. And that makes them a little bit more vulnerable to things like habitat loss or climate change if their host plants are also being impacted by those threats as well. And then this genus of bees is also thought to have low fecundity. So that's few offspring per individual species, individual bee. So far, these are preliminary results, but so far we have about 25% of those species are data deficient, this gray quarter, and then about 2/3 that are considered least concern, and then the remainder are in a threatened category. And I'm going to highlight a couple of species that I've identified so far as threatened. So one of them is Andrena balsameriae. This has a draft rank of endangered. This species is a very narrow dietary specialist. It only forages from the silverleaf sunray and Coeliopsis argophylla, which is itself a threatened plant species. It's had an extinction risk assessment done, and it is facing some risk of extinction. The bee comes from a really small range from the Las Vegas area, and it sees a number of threats in its range, including impacts to its host plant due to climate change. There's a potential for phenological mismatch. So when we have such a narrow relationship between the bee and the flower, the timing of both of those life cycles is really important. And with climate change, many of those relationships are subject to shift a little bit. So if, for example, the bee emerges way too early and the plant is not there, that's a phenological mismatch. So that there's a potential for that for this species. Its habitat is also degraded due to recreational impacts, as well as livestock and gypsum mining. And then it's also seen a loss of habitat due to urbanization. Okay, so what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side of the screen is all of the known records for Andrena balsameriae. So you can see it's just right around Las Vegas and also Lake Mead. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you all of the known records for its host plant in Coeliopsis argophylla. And remember, this is a really tight relationship that can't be shifted. So looking at this, we can see that if some of this habitat is degraded, some of the bees' habitat is degraded, there's not really very many other areas it can go. There's not a lot of other suitable habitat for this species based on just where its host plant occurs. Another species that I've examined is Andrena anatolis. This has a draft rank of critically endangered. It's not been observed in most of its range since 1972. So this range map is showing you in red its entire historic range. And then this tiny little orange triangle is where it's been observed since 1972, the only records that it has since 1972. Those come from an area of just about 130 kilometers squared, which is less than 1% of its historic range. And what we know from looking at the way that bees have been sampled across its entire range, there's been pretty high search effort for bees generally across the rest of its range in a time period that might be able to detect this species. And so we know that there's been pretty good search effort, meaning that it may truly be absent from some of these areas that it used to occur. This species is a pollen specialist. It visits plants from the genus Camisonia, which is pictured here on the left. And it occurs in highly threatened habitat in California coastal sage scrub, which is really impacted by urbanization in the San Diego, Los Angeles region. There's some elements of sort of the value of real estate in that area that also presents a number of challenges for conservation lands as well. And then the last species that I'll highlight is Andrena brooksii. This is a species that's known from just about 120 observations. Its ecology and habitat are not very well understood. I'm showing you a picture of its example habitat and then its host plant down here. It's probably a pollen specialist bee. It's been observed foraging from the genus Cimzia. And I think this is an interesting example of sort of some issues with the data that accompany records. So this map is a little bit small, but it occurs in extreme southeast Arizona and parts of New Mexico. And it occurs right in proximity to where an annual bee course is held. This is a course that has international draw, and some of the best bee taxonomists and bee scientists come to this site to collect bees. And that's why the species was probably discovered and recorded. So the area sees exceptionally high search effort from people that really know their stuff, and but it's not regularly observed. So there's a number of localities that have been visited 9-10 times, but the species has only been detected a couple of times in those localities. And so it really there's still a lot of questions about like what are the conditions that produced this observation. And so that's some of the questions that I'd like answered. But for now, the species has draft rank of vulnerable, and we hope to see it again soon. Okay, I just want to thank our supporters for their generous funding that makes this work possible, including the contribution of Xerces Society members. And I'm happy to stay in touch. There's my work email, and then the project email is listed below. So please feel free to give a shout if you want to, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Saff. That was really,
Yeah.
really interesting. And yeah, really interesting to go into such depth there. We are getting a lot of questions, so we'll try and
Great.
answer as many as we can. Kicking off here, let's see, I had it marked. um, where, oh, yeah. Um, Starting with the data, starting at the beginning of the steps in this process, Laura wants to know who digitizes this data.
Yeah, that is probably largely done by undergrads and grad students at natural history collections at colleges and universities. It's not very well funded generally, so which is why it's often given as a student project for some of the students that work in these facilities. But yeah, hard work, pretty labor intensive. You get to look at a lot of bees, but it's probably kind of a slog.
Great. Thank you, Saff. And that leads into our next question when you were showing the map of the states and how many bee species have been observed. Is there any particular reason some states have more bee data than others?
Yeah, we've seen a number of states start to do wild bee atlases in their state. So one of the states that has really high observations is Vermont. I think on that map, it's like 98% of the species that are known to occur there have been observed in the last 10 years. And that's largely due to a state bee atlas. So some of these states are developing programs for community members to get trained up on how to identify bees. They go out and collect, and then they identify and make those data public. So that's probably a big driver of that. Another driver of that might just be that those states are where some of the more active bee taxonomists live. Sometimes when I display all bee data, you can actually see like more records centered around where I know that bee taxonomist lives. That's kind of an interesting relic in the data.
Yeah, that's funny, but that makes sense. Or where certain bee labs are located across the country. Yeah, That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, that's a great lead into this next question too, about states and species that may warrant listing. Jillian wants to know, when you say a listing may be warranted, but be precluded by higher priorities, what does that mean? They're supposing, does that mean that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service only lists species they have the capacity to manage?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that's that. To be honest, I don't totally know. That's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife decision, and I'm not sure exactly what all the ingredients in their decision-making process is. But I know that that agency has been underfunded for a while now, and so they are limited in just like what they can possibly review, what they can possibly protect and offer legal protection. So I think that's a really good guess of like they don't have the resources to actually develop some of the conservation materials for that species, and so it gets kind of put on the wait list.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you, Saff. And I'm going to continue on
Mhm.
the line of questioning about listings. I know that none of us have crystal balls or can see what's going to happen in the future. Linda Rawls is wondering, with the EPA's rescinding of the definition of harm, what do you expect that impact to be on bees? Since it seems like few people would directly harm, for example, the rusty patched bumblebee, but it would be more indirect harm.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that's a great question with regards to like actually harming bees. When we see that definition of harm being used, it's for things that might get hunted or poached, and that's not something we really see in bees, but it does have an impact on the habitat. So making sure that one of the main things that we can do to conserve bees is making sure that we're conserving their habitat. So if the definition of harm changes to not include impacts to the habitat, that's a huge loss for bees and other invertebrates that might not be harmed in these other sort of more like common definitions of that word. Yeah, when it comes to habitat, that's really an issue for bees.
Yeah, understandably. Bouncing around a little bit here. Again, we're getting so many questions.
Yay!
Yeah. Back to the data. Someone wants to know, how have you been defining data deficiency? Just curious about that.
Yeah, great question. There are a couple of uh, There are a couple of ways to do that. One of them is if a species has very few records. So I'll just also say that the methods that I've presented here are sort of in process. And so things may change, but so far, if a species is known from fewer than 5 records, we can't make a species distribution model for it with good confidence. So already, if it doesn't have very many data points, then we can't really analyze its range. Also, if it has few data points and those data points are very old, like it's not been recorded since the 50s, that's another criteria that could qualify a species for data deficient. There's a number of other, there's another sort of uncommon scenario where data are sort of just by accident, or I don't know what exactly contributes to this, where data are in a line. If there's only 3 data points and they are aligned, we can't like draw a range that's meaningful for that species because it's just a line from one data point to the other. And that sort of arrangement of data also is a threshold for data deficiency.
Okay, thank you, Saf. And talking about
Mhm.
data deficiency, I know that AI is a new thing that's being used in many different fields. It might be too soon, but do you know if AI methods have been used to organize data and analyze data so far in this field?
Yeah, I don't know about organizing so much, analyzing maybe, but what I do know more about AI and bee research is that there are a number of different ways that people are trying to use AI to identify bees from images, which is still needs some work for sure. Still under work. It's not a very reliable way to identify bees yet, but that's one way that AI has been used.
Yeah, I'm sure that is a whole new subject that'll continue to evolve potentially.
Yeah.
Um, okay, keeping on with specific species, data, all of that. Um, community science as a source for some data. Now that people are doing focus surveys for proposed bumblebees, are you seeing any patterns with those species relating to them being proposed for listing? We have uh, shares my name. Amber wants to know they're most interested in Crotch's bumblebee, and are you finding it
Hmm.
in more in one portion of its former range than others?
Yeah, I don't actually know too much about some of the bumblebee work that we do because bumblebees are only 50 species of bees out of the 3,600 species. And we have a whole team that works on bumblebees, and I sort of work on all of the rest of the bumblebees. So I would direct you to some of our other bumblebee staff. But what I do know is that because because all of the bumblebees have had their extinction risks assessed, and we were able to determine which species are threatened and which ones are stable, we can do this directed survey effort where we have efforts standardized surveys through like the Bumblebee Atlas programs. And that kind of data that's developed from those programs allow for some of the things that I was talking about, like assessing a population trend over time, because the data that are generated from bumblebee atlases are such a higher quality than just museum specimen records. You are able then to look at some of those trends. I just don't know what those trends are, and I'm sure our bumblebee team would be happy to answer that question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Saff. And quite a few folks are asking about partnerships that you might have. So I'm just going to combine a couple of these here. Are you working
Yeah.
with any Canadian insect specialists, the Oregon or Washington Bee Atlas? And have you heard of the California Volunteer Conservation Corps that pays volunteers for their activities?
Okay. In Canada, we have a number of partners that are collaborating on the methods development process that we're doing. So, making sure that bee researchers from all over agree that the methods that we're proposing are the best and most meaningful methods. Because the scope of my project and the funding that I receive is just for US bee species, I'm not working on any explicitly Canadian species, but many US bee species have ranges that extend into Canada and Mexico and sometimes Guatemala for that matter. And so when I am working with a species like that, I'm reaching out to biologists in wherever those species occur to collaborate with them and make sure I'm getting their input. The Atlas question, yeah, when data from the Washington and Oregon atlases are made publicly available, we can use them. So that's a huge lift that those volunteers are doing, and when the data are publicly available, it's a huge contribution to the project. And then the last one was about the California conservation something, which I have not heard of, but I'm excited to learn more about.
It was the California Volunteer Conservation Corps, and it says the state
Okay.
encourages volunteers. They pay the participation for their volunteer activities. So it could be a good resource.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Building right off of that, speaking of volunteers, community science, we have a lot of people really interested in wondering how helpful or not are observations in, the Seek iNaturalist apps. Do you use
Hmm.
any data from those apps for this research?
Yeah. Yeah. We do. There are a number, because of some of the ways that those data are identified, we have a certain amount of skepticism. So once something has been identified in iNaturalist by two people, it becomes research grade. And then that we can use that. But then I like to vet that further by making sure it was identified by a bee taxonomist that I know and trust. Um, and we're pretty small. The bee taxonomy research community is pretty small, so I sort of know whose identifications to look for. But yeah, those contributions definitely add to the assessment process and are being used when they're high enough quality.
Great. Thank you so much, Saff. We had a few questions I'm going to combine about host plant and specialist bees and endangered bees. Are there any critically endangered bee species being kept in collections with the required pollinator plant species, if that is even possible? And are they able to switch? So if their host plant disappears for a specialist bee, can it switch to another plant in order to survive?
Yeah. With regards to the first question, I don't know of that being true. And I'm not totally sure what this asker meant. Like, and I just want to clarify that when I'm talking about specimens in museums, unfortunately, they're dead on a pin. So they're not like a like like conservation germplasm, like some other collections can be. So what that looks like in a museum is mostly that all of the plants are in one room and all of the bees are in another room and the birds are in another room. So those things are the organisms are not usually curated together, but the data is overlapped when it's available. And what was the second question?
Yeah, sorry. If
No worries.
specialist bee species can switch their host plant if
Yes.
one
Yeah.
disappears.
No, they cannot. These specialist relationships are evolved over hundreds and thousands of years, and they are constrained a number of different ways. So sometimes specialist bees are physiologically constrained to the pollen that they eat from. And so if they like literally can't digest pollen from another plant, or they're neurologically constrained, like the bee doesn't actually like physically recognize a certain, like if it's a sunflower specialist, it like will not recognize a pea flower as food. Sometimes they're like mechanically constrained, so they don't have the right sort of anatomy to manipulate certain flowers. So these are really tight relationships that don't switch. They do sort of run the spectrum from there's species that only specialize on one single plant. And then there's species that specialize within a whole plant family, like Asteraceae, the sunflower family. So with it, that's a very species-rich family. So bees that specialize on that plant family might have a lot of options to choose from, but they wouldn't be able to switch to a different family.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense biologically from what I know to take a tangent. I know orcas, for example, they can some only eat salmon and some only eat
Yeah,
harbor seals and they can't switch if one is less available. So that's super interesting to me. Thank you so much, Seth.
yeah,
Yeah, very interesting. And yeah, just the complexity, like you mentioned, the mechanical mismatches or the neurological. A unfortunate but great segue into this next question. So if there is lack of an available host plant or a phenological mismatch, what are the mitigation options? What are the ways to help protect species? We had another question. How can bees native to vernal pools, for example, if they're losing protection for that, how can those bees be protected?
yeah, yeah. So this asker has really hit the nail on the head with regards to the maintaining the plant communities that live there to the best that we're able. So number one option is conserving their habitat. Number two option is making sure that its host plants can continue to thrive. So in the case of like a restoration project, that would be ensuring that its host plants are in the seed mix or something like that. When we don't have that much information, members of the public can still try to address this by planting a diversity of native plants in their yards. So even if we don't know what species are endangered and we don't know like what specific species live in your yard, you can take care of the needs of most of them by planting from lots of different plant families in your yard and having blooms that occur from early spring to late fall to make sure that you're feeding as many bees as possible. So that's the food element, but then we also need safe places to nest. So making sure your the entire habitat is not paved over, for example, or rocked over with like rock mulch, which is very common where I live in Arizona. Leaving some bare ground available, and then also providing protection from pesticides. So reducing the pesticide load, and that can be advocated for on both wildlands and also employed in your home or local library or wherever as well.
I love that. Thank you, Saff. Kind of highlighting some of our main tenants, providing nesting sites, reducing pesticides, and planting native. I did want to mention that I know we're at the top of the hour. If folks need to go, this is being recorded and it is going to be posted on our YouTube channel. But we are going to stick around for about 13 more minutes and try to get through these 12 questions. So if we do a question per minute, we'll be doing great. But thank you so much, Saff, for staying on and answering our questions. We're getting
Yeah,
questions from the audience.
pleasure.
Next one I have, I believe you touched on your specific, some of your specific funding sources, but where do funds come to research native bees in the US more in general?
Yeah, great question. All kinds of places. There's private foundation funding that comes that is from organizations that are interested in doing conservation, and I've received some funding for this project from that. Lots of federal funding historically and possibly into the future. The way that I'm funded now is federal money that's funneled through a state wildlife agency through a competitive state wildlife grant. So that's federal dollars that are allocated through the state wildlife programs. Also different research institutions, the National Science Foundation. What else? And Xerces members, private donors. Yeah. A lot of federal and state money usually is used for this kind of conservation work.
Thanks for explaining that. Okay, moving
Yeah.
right along, couple more questions. Marion wants to know, is eDNA still not a viable sampling method for bees? Is it just a lack of sufficient genetic data or something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't actually kept up on some of the eDNA conversation lately. I think that probably still need a lot of information. Not every single bee species is barcoded, and there's a number of species that we have kind of mushy species concepts for that need work. So we still sort of need it doesn't replace the work that taxonomists do because of that mushiness in species concepts. So we still need taxonomists to be refining our concept of species through the use of DNA barcoding, and then with a good set of data that includes DNA barcodes for all bee species and good species concepts for them, then employing eDNA might be a little more feasible. I think also at the onset of eDNA, it was very expensive to take that many samples and then run them through the laboratory. So I think that's probably a huge influence on when that sampling protocol gets picked up for wider use is the cost.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you so much for explaining, Saff. How do you deal with recent taxonomic changes that aren't reflected in the national databases?
Great question. One of the strengths of the data that I use comes from that Cheshire et al. Paper that I mentioned in the presentation. This is all of the digitized museum specimen records for the US that have been cleaned and vetted by taxonomists. So that provides the backbone of the data that I use. So has had a lot of the taxonomic issues and changes resolved already by experts. And then another way that is dealt with is that the assessment process. Once I have an assessment for a species, I then it gets reviewed by bee researchers with expertise on the specific species. And so at some point that can be detected there. But also just trying to keep up with those taxonomic changes ahead of time and making sure that I'm using the appropriate data for the accepted species name, which is a little bit of a struggle, but can be done.
Yes, thank you for that. Okay, we had another question. This might be a little related to a few questions, actually. And maybe you already touched on this, but how can perhaps someone's personal collections be digitized? And also, is there a list of people that can help with correct identifications if folks want to help?
Yeah. The easiest way probably to have your collection digitized is to donate it to museum. If you don't want to donate it and you want to hold on to it, there are some ways to do that, and I don't know them off the top of my head. So if you have asked this question, you have a collection and you want, I can help set you up with people to help digitize that. And you can email stateofthebees@xerces.org and I can connect you. But yeah, easiest would be donating it to museum. What was the second part of that question?
Oh, lists of people who maybe can help with correct identifications.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you live in a town or a city with a university and they have an entomology collection, I would recommend getting in touch with the curators there. And a lot of the times they accept members of the public to come in and compare their specimens to specimens they have on record. You might be able to use the microscopes. They can recommend some taxonomists for you. If you don't live in a region with a institution like that, I guess I would recommend finding the closest one and asking there.
Thanks for explaining that. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think if we didn't post that email in the chat, I will right now.
Great, thank you.
Great. And a few folks have asked about resources for what plants they can be helping to support bees and pollinators. I did just post our Pollinator Resource Center link in the chat. That includes native plant suppliers and seed directory for your area and habitat installation resources, as well as plant lists that are specific to your region. So I know from that the answer to this next question is yes, but can a host plant support both, say, a bee species and a moth species at the same time?
Yeah, I think on many of the plant lists that Xerces has developed, there's little icons for like each individual species that a plant might support. So there are a number of species that have multi-uses, and I'll add just that can extend beyond the invertebrate world as well. So can be supportive to wildlife generally. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Speaking of those plant relationships, a little bit more back on the biology, are all endangered bee species feeding on endangered plants? I think that's a really interesting question. If there's
Oh,
maybe
great
always
question.
a one-to-one. Yeah.
No. Yeah, that is, not the case. And that, like many of our bumblebees forage from a wide variety of plants. Most bumblebees are considered dietary generalists, so they'll forage from all sorts of different plants, but they are still endangered. So like the rusty patch bumblebee forages from all different kinds of plants. Some of our other bumblebees that we know about are, generalists. So they're more impacted. I won't say that they're not impacted by like changes in their availability of food plants. Like that could be a impact of habitat loss and degradation, is there's just less food overall for them. But it's not necessarily this tight relationship that leads to imperilment.
Great, thank you, Saff. We're getting down to our last few questions here. Eugenia, I wanted to give you a thank you so much and also ask, what type of methodology are you using to determine the specificity of bee diets?
Yeah, that is largely comes from literature review. And so there are a number of publications on certain species that describe a bee's diet. And then we also run some of that by other experts. And it's an area where there could be a lot more work. We lack a lot of information that we want to know about bee life history and their biology generally. And sometimes this comes up where a species has been listed as a dietary specialist because it's only ever been recorded on a certain plant. But then when I look at the records for that species, I see that everything we know about this bee species is from one single collection event, like one day, one place, 1 hour, one collector. And so like, well, yeah, it was only recorded on one species in that collection event, but what if we'd collected it like 2 weeks later in a different place? So there are some issues like that I parse through. But yeah, there's a lot of good published information about that.
Thank you, Saff. All right. Combining a couple other questions into our last one here. You already touched on folks, if they have personal collections, they could donate to museums. But are there other ways that folks can help this project if they have data of their own to share, whether anecdotal or researchers, or also if they could offer to have species studied on their property if they know they have species
Mm,
present there? Any recommendations or resources we can point to?
yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate the intention. It's always like very heartening to be in scenarios like this and be struggling through the quality of the data and the quantity and have people being like, I want to share my data. I want to contribute. So there are a couple of ways. You contributing to the existing Bumblebee Atlas project is a great way to help build some of our understanding of bumblebees. With regards to the rest of the bees, they're a lot harder to contribute like citizen science, community science data to because of the difficulty in identifying them. So if you already like using iNaturalist and you like submitting points that way, that can be helpful. If you live in a state where there's a wild bee atlas, volunteering for that. If you have a lot of time and interest on your hands, I would chat with entomology collections local to you to see if they need volunteers to digitize their data. That's a pretty heavy lift, so not for the faint of heart. And then if you have data or observations or concerns about a given species, you can email that to stateofthebees@xerces.org. I'm happy to accept your data. And I'll just note that we're really grateful to accept data and are happy to make sure that we're properly crediting our data donors. So happy to talk with you about that if you'd like to donate data. Yeah, those are the main ways. And I think that once a lot of these assessments come out, we'll have like a smaller subset. That the long-term hope is that we have a subset of species that we know we want more information about. And so at that point, we can sort of start to ask some of those questions and see how to get community members involved in that process. So stay tuned.
Yeah, thank you so much. Awesome. Really, like you said, heartening to hear that people want to help.
Yeah.
And if you want to dedicate your time to helping digitize all of that, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Saff. This has been really fantastic, really informative, sometimes some really surprising statistics about how much we do or do not know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carly, so much for your help today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. This webinar will be on YouTube in a couple of days. And I also wanted to add that Saff was just featured on an episode of Bug Banter. So if you want to learn more about the State of the Bees initiative, you can give that a listen. You can find that on our website as well. So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a wonderful day, everyone.